Good afternoon. Thanks for your support of public television. I'm John Roseman, and I'm a family psychologist from Gastonia, North Carolina, an author, a syndicated columnist, a public speaker, et cetera, et cetera. Welcome. We are going to be talking about parenting the strong-willed child this afternoon, and I thought I would begin with a story I heard in Miami a few years ago. I was there in August, and I was doing a workshop for teachers in the parochial schools of South Miami. During the break in the workshop in the morning, a woman whom I estimated to be about my mother's age, I think based on the date she gave me that was probably accurate, she came up to me and she told me that she had a story she'd like to share with me. She said, "John, I started teaching in 1947. In 1950, they gave me 70 first graders." I was also stunned. My reaction was, "Well, certainly you were not the only teacher in the room." She said, "Oh no, John, it was just me and 70 students. I didn't even have an aide." The story went like this. Before the beginning of the school year, there were to have been 2 classes of 35 first graders each. The day before the school year started, the other first grade teacher called in and told the head of the school that she was not going to be able to teach that year. Her husband had just suddenly been transferred, and she was going to have to uproot the family and move halfway across the country, and she could come in for a couple of days perhaps, but she didn't feel like that was really warranted or even advantageous for the children involved. The Mother Superior agreed, put down the phone, went and got this woman, told her what had happened, and said, "We can't turn away 35 children tomorrow. You're going to have to take all 70 until we find a replacement." So they moved these kids into the largest room in the school that would serve as a classroom, lined up 70 desks in 10 rows of 7, and this woman began teaching 70 first graders, 70. This is her 3rd year teaching. She's 24, 25 years old. Let me give you a profile of these kids. I started first grade in a parochial school in 1952 in Charleston, South Carolina. First of all, Catholic schools have never served any elite population of children. They've always drawn from a fairly broad demographic and socioeconomic base in their communities. So these kids came from a variety of backgrounds. Secondly, most of these children had never had a preschool experience. Most of these kids had come to first grade without even having gone to kindergarten. And furthermore, most of these kids came to school without knowing their ABCs, number facts, or anything else like that we feel so compelled to teach children during their preschool years today. I came to school in 1952 knowing the ABC song. That was it. I could not have identified more than, I'm sure, 5 letters of the alphabet correctly. Other kids I knew the song, but the song was kind of in anticipation of learning the letters we were singing in the song. So, with that in mind, on with the story. Here she is teaching 70 first graders. 70. By the way, maybe an unusually high number, but not in and of itself an unusual situation. Most classrooms in the early 1950s were, by today's standards, overcrowded. My first grade class picture, Sacred Heart School, Charleston, South Carolina. There are 50 children in the picture. 4 children are listed as absent. Sister Mary was the only teacher. She had no aide. She taught 54 children. Now, I don't remember first grade very well, so I'll just gloss over that and go to the 3rd grade, my next class picture in my scrapbook. 3rd grade, Mrs. Hoy's class. There are 42 children in the class picture. Mrs. Hoy is by herself. She had no aide, and 3 children are listed as absent. Now, I do remember the 3rd grade. It was the first year that I really enjoyed school. I remember this: an orderly learning environment. I do not remember any major disruptions. I do not remember any single children who caused constant problems, etc., etc. In the early 1950s, we were in the midst of a baby boom and a teacher shortage. There were not teachers lined up outside every school in America waiting for job openings. You had to beat the bushes to find qualified people back in those days. So this woman knew she was in it for at least a few weeks, but she had no idea what would ultimately happen. Here were her exact words. John, after 6 weeks, when they realized I was having no problems at all, they decided to save money and leave me with them all year long. And John, now I'm paraphrasing. I wrote those words down, committed them to memory, but now I'm paraphrasing. And John, I really had no serious problems ever. There were no children who gave me constant difficulty. An outbreak of mischief here, an outbreak of mischief there, but that's to be expected from children, especially young ones. And John, and now the most remarkable aspect of her testimony, put it into this context. In the early 1950s, the most strenuous school system in America was the Catholic school. It was the most difficult system for a child to successfully negotiate. Catholic schools did not promote you. Public schools didn't back then either, because they wanted to preserve your self-esteem. The Catholic schools set the bar here, and the bar was relatively high at any grade level. If you did not clear the bar, you did not go on. Catholic education back then did not lower the bar for any given child based on a perceived disability, a learning style issue, etc., etc., etc. If you didn't clear the bar, you didn't go on. John, all 70 children learned to read and write well enough to go to the 2nd grade. And furthermore, they all read from the same reader. There was one reading group in this classroom that consisted of 70 first graders. Isn't this remarkable? And anyone who hears the story today would be within their rights, for lack of a better phrase, to say, well, you know, that may have happened. I don't doubt the truth of that, but that was certainly an unusual situation. I don't think that that was happening all over the country. I told this story at a convention of Catholic educators in September of 2000. And there were about 800 Catholic educators present, Raleigh, North Carolina. After the talk, dozens, literally dozens of people came up and surrounded me and told me similar stories. They shared with me similar testimonies. All people older than myself, all people probably ready to retire from Catholic education. But these people, one after another, said, oh yes, John, I taught 58 children in the 3rd grade in 1952, and John, I had 45 in the 6th grade, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And each and every person said, and we had no problems to speak of. These children sat and paid attention, did what they were told, and we went from one lesson to another without any much hitch or stumble. Now, when I tell this story to an audience today, in the 21st century, everyone out in the audience is thinking, well, this could not happen today. It could not happen today. And you are absolutely right if you are thinking that. This could not happen today. It could not happen today. No teacher in her right mind would take even 35 first graders by herself. No, this could not happen today. Because the level of problems in the typical American classroom today is too high to permit classroom size to be much above 25 to 28. And then every teacher, especially in the early grades, requires an aide to help her with classroom management. What has happened, ladies and gentlemen? We're here gathered to talk about the strong-willed child. Obviously, none of those 70 children were strong-willed. The strong-willed child is defiant and uncooperative and argumentative and resistant and belligerent and disrespectful of adult authority. That's basically the description we associate with the strong-willed child. Typically, the strong-willed child is reported to be a major behavior problem at home, and typically the strong-willed child is reported to be a behavior problem to one degree or another at school as well. Well, where in all of these testimonies is there evidence that there were many of what we would call today strong-willed children populating America's classrooms back in the 1950s and before? But they certainly populate America's classrooms today. And the reason they populate America's classrooms today is because we are no longer in America doing, during the preschool years, what the pre-modern parent did to prepare her children for school. Grandma. Grandma is the term that I use to refer generically to the pre-modern parent. And the pre-modern parent is any parent who completed most of his or her child rearing by 1955. So if a woman's children were 12 years old and older in 1955, you've completed most of your child rearing by the teenage years. You're just reaping what you've sowed at that point, you know. Then she qualifies as a pre-modern mother. The pre-modern mother, grandma, a grandma today, maybe a great-grandmother, she understood something about children that we are loath to accept today. She understood that every child brings into the world with him a nature that is not a pretty thing. Grandma understood that children bring into the world a nature, and every child brings into the world the same human nature. Every child brings into the world a nature that inclines this child toward antisocial behavior, toward being disrespectful and belligerent, disobedient, violent, argumentative, etc., etc., etc. All those things we associate with the so-called strong-willed child, they are all aspects of original nature, our original nature. They were aspects of your nature when you came into the world, mine, and they are aspects of our children's original nature brought into the world by every single human child today. The difference is that people 50 plus years ago accepted this. They knew that human nature was not a pretty thing. They knew that human nature inclined the child toward narcissism. And the narcissist is basically a person who possesses a criminal personality. Grandma understood that every human child comes into the world with the narcissistic flame flickering inside of him. And that what she had to do during the first 2 years or so of her child's life grew the narcissistic flame into a narcissistic fire. Now, what Grandma had to do and did is what each and every one of you, because no one ever comes to my talks who is not responsible, conscientious, hard-working parent who wants to do the right thing. This is what you have done during the first 2 years of your children's lives. Every one of you at home who is listening to this is what you have done during the first 2 years of your children's lives, assuming that you are responsible, conscientious, concerned, committed parents. What do you do during this time? The first season of parenthood, you serve. You serve. You orbit around this child who already has the narcissistic flame flickering inside of him. You orbit around him in a constant ministry of service, doing things for him, getting him things, carrying him places, comforting him whenever he is upset, etc. Do you for a moment think that this child, with absolutely no concept of history, with absolutely no idea that before his advent there have been thousands of years of human history and that there is more to come, Do you think for a moment that this child understands that he is completely dependent? No. He thinks, and he has every right to think this way from his point of view, that he is running the show. And he confirms this every time he makes a loud noise. Someone, an adult, one of his parents, generally appears and says, "How may I serve you, my lord? What may I do to comfort you?" And we translate this child's signals and screams, and we finally figure it out. And meanwhile, we're running around like headless chickens, you know, trying to figure, is it this? Will this make you happy? Well, no, how about this, you know? We roll these children through shopping centers and other public places in portable thrones, and within which they sit and survey their domains, and perfect strangers come and kneel before these thrones. Now, by the time a child is 2 years old, folks, the narcissistic flame has grown into a narcissistic fire. And grandma, the pre-modern, pre-psychologically thinking parent, understood that now she had to shift out of service to her child, slowly but surely. She, because the mother has been doing most of the service for the first 2 years of life, and that's still the case even in this postmodern liberated age, she had to redefine herself to her child. In order to quench this flame and bring it back under control, you can never extinguish it entirely. All you can hope to do is reduce it again to a narcissistic flicker. And this is what the pre-modern mother did. With her husband's support, between her child's second and third birthdays, she led her child out of narcissism. She redefined herself to her child. She led her child out of the bondage of narcissism. And by the time that child was 3 years old, he saw his mother with totally new eyes. A year ago, he had perceived a woman who was bent over, doing things for him down at this level. And now he saw a woman who was upright, quite often with her hands on her hips. A year ago, he had been able to get this woman's attention by making a loud noise. And quite often now, this woman wouldn't give him the time of day if he made a loud noise. He saw her as a formidable, indomitable authority figure. A woman who could change his life in an instant. This woman had moved into the second season of parenthood. The first season is between birth and age 2, approximately. The second season begins after this tremendously important transition between the second and third birthdays. And during this time, we refer to the child's behavior as a manifestation of what we call the terrible twos. As the child screams in protest at what he sees as being done by his mother. She is taking control, not of him, because, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things I'm going to try and get across to you as an audience and our audience at home as well is you cannot control your child. What can you control? You can control your relationship with your child. And this is what these pre-modern mothers did. By the time their children were 3 years old, these women were in firm control of their relationships with their children. So you've got 3 kinds of parents really in the world today. You've got parents who try to control their children. That's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. Human beings are created with free will, the ability to choose. No power on this earth can mitigate free will. You cannot make your child make certain choices. It is impossible to do so. People who try to control their children end up being very frustrated, very angry, under a lot of stress, resentful quite often of their children. That's the first type of parent we find in the world today. The second type of parent is a parent who is not controlling the only thing they can control, which is their relationship with their child. These people also become very frustrated. They feel themselves to be under almost constant stress in their parent roles. They're quite often very angry and resentful toward their children, and then alternately guilty because they're angry and resentful toward their children. And the third type of parent is a parent who simply controls what is possible, which is the relationship. How do you control your child's relationship with you and vice versa? Number one, you control your child's access to you. Now, you cannot do this during the first 2 years, folks. You've got to orbit in that ministry of service. But if we are attuned, and most of us are no longer, those parents who are attuned still to the seasons of parenthood still understand, and they are few and far between intuitively, that as you move into the second season, you must begin controlling your child's access to you. He had unlimited access during the first 2 years. That must never again be the case. If it is the case, then he still perceives you as a servant, and you don't respect the servants. You take them for granted. You don't want your children to take you for granted. You want their respect. Not for your benefit, not because you get anything out of being, exalted by a 2-year-old, but for his benefit, because respect for other people is where self-respect begins. It is the seed of self-respect. So these people moved into the second season understanding this. Understanding that they had to begin during that time building a wall around themselves, slowly but surely, as the child got older. At the age of 2, the wall was only this high. By the time the child was 2.5, it was this high, and by the time the child was 3, the wall was this high. These mothers set a gate into the wall with a lock on it. And many of you can relate to this, folks. You could not get to your mother at whim from that point on. You had to, figuratively speaking, come to the gate and knock. We are not giving women permission in America to do this anymore. Every woman in this audience knows, whether you've done this or not. If you've done it, you are the sore thumb in the female community. We do not give permission for women when their children are around 2 years old to begin building the wall and setting the gate. Because the nouveau definition, the postmodern definition of good mother, says the good mother serves as well as she can in perpetuity. In fact, as her child gets older, the good mother tries to find more and more and more ways to demonstrate her service to the child. Well, see, Grandma was moving out of service and into leadership, and you cannot mix the two. You cannot mix leadership and service to any great degree. Granted, there will still be times, even with a 5-year-old child, when you have to serve. But these occasions with a child who has passed his or her 3rd birthday should be the exception, not the rule from that point on. But today, these are no longer exceptions. In the child's relationship with the mother in America today, all too often we see a mother who has never defined herself as a formidable, indomitable authority figure to her child. And folks, there are several consequences to this. The first consequence is your child doesn't pay attention to you when you talk. Now we're beginning to talk about the strong-willed child, you see. And by the way, the myth is that You know, there are certain children born into the world with this sort of temperamental disposition that causes them to be defiant and belligerent and disrespectful. Where was this temperamental disposition 50 years ago? The further implication is that these problems that we're having with these defiant and belligerent children today are in some way related to genetic anomalies. Where were these genes 50 years ago? They didn't inhabit any of these 70 children in that classroom in South Miami. See, all of this is myth, folks. Myth to cover up the fact, to a large degree, to cover up the fact that we mental health professionals, we psychologists, et cetera, have not given you good advice concerning the rearing of children. We have not given you good direction. And now we're covering it all up by saying, well, the mistakes that we have unleashed, the problems that we have unleashed in America through our advice. Well, no, they're not because of our advice. They're because of, you know, dysfunctional family situations, and they're because of biochemical imbalances and so on. Anything but to say, excuse us, we're really sorry, we gave you bad advice. We actually thought there was something new under the sun concerning children and child rearing, and we, with the help of the electronic media in America, we were able to propagandize you to the effect that we knew something new under the sun about kids, and that if you wanted to figure out what that was, you needed to humble yourselves before us. Setting the gate, building the wall, establishing yourself as an authority figure. Most children 50 years ago were afraid of their mothers by the time they were 3.5, 4 years old. These were mothers who were not, you know, running after their children during the day with switches and belts. These were, you know, loving women. But we were afraid of them, not because they presented some threat to life and limb, but because in the eyes of a 3-year-old child, from that perspective, a woman who has seized rightful control of the parent-child relationship by age 3 is seen as an awesomely powerful human being. And fear is the primitive emotion behind that. Fear. What's happened today? We've caused the American mother today to be afraid, to cause her child to be afraid of her. A child who is afraid of his mother today, in the same sense that I was afraid of mine. I didn't, you know, my knees didn't buckle when she came into the room. My mouth didn't go dry. I didn't start to sweat. But I'll tell you what the manifestation of this fear was. It was a scriptural fear. It says in Scripture, there is joy and wisdom in fearing the Lord. If there's joy and wisdom in fearing our Heavenly Father, what is the problem with a child's fear of his or her parents? In fact, there is no problem with this at all, per se. As long as we're not talking about parents who actually constitute a physical danger to the child. And nobody listening to this program, in all likelihood, falls into that category, so I'm not going to pursue that line of thinking. It is to the child's benefit to fear because then the child pays attention. It is to the child's benefit to pay attention. The child who's paying attention to authority figures can be taught. The more effectively the child can be taught, the more rapidly the child matures in his understanding of how the world works. The more rapidly the child matures in his understanding of how the world works, the more happy the child will ultimately be. Do you know that today's children are not even as happy as children were 35 years ago? I said this recently before an audience, and a fellow in my profession came up and challenged me afterwards. John, that was an irresponsible statement to make, totally, you know, pulled out of your hat. You cannot prove with any numbers that today's children are not as happy as children were 35 years ago. That's an invention, and he went on and on and on. There's no happiness measure. I said, excuse me, but there is a happiness measure. It's a happiness measure that people in our profession collect constantly. It's called the rate of child and teen depression. And folks, since the mid-60s, when we began looking at child mental health very, very conscientiously, because we began seeing that there were so many children who were behaving in ways that children really didn't behave in just 20 years before to any great degree at all, that these children were now everywhere, figuratively speaking. Since 1965, the rate of child and teen depression, which takes into consideration explosions in population size, has, by some estimates, increased tenfold. The most conservative estimate is a five-fold increase, which means today's child is considerably more at risk, despite his parents' socioeconomic level, despite demographics, despite educational level of his parents, etc., than was the typical child of 35 to 40 years ago, at considerably more risk for unhappiness in his life. Such unhappiness that this child may at some point in time be referred to a mental health professional. You know, it's interesting that most people in my generation, I'm 53 years old, most people I talk to them and I ask, were you afraid of your mom? Oh yeah, is the answer. Oh yeah, I was afraid of my mom. I mean, why? Did she ever beat you? Most of these people say, no, I got maybe 2 spankings from my mom my entire childhood. That's a common report. Well, why did you fear her then? What was there about her to fear? I don't know, they say. I don't know, but I just was afraid of her. It was an intangible thing that we couldn't even define. It would be easy if we could say, well, my mother beat me, you know, every other day with a razor strap, you know, but that's not the case. Here's another manifestation of this fear. What a wonderful thing. Consider this. You parents in the audience, consider if you could do this. Many of your mothers did this. All these women had to do was look. That's all. And the child stopped what he was doing dead in his tracks. See, this was a peaceful parenting style, folks. For the most part. I mean, there are always exceptions to everything I say. There's somebody out in the audience who goes, well, my parents weren't very peaceful, but I tell you, I'm in touch with more American parents today than any other person in my field. And I talk to people in my generation about their childhood experiences all the time. And I can tell you that there is no evidence whatsoever that there were many children, relatively speaking, to speak of, who were physically abused as children, or even whose parents used physical discipline as a primary form of discipline. A poll was recently taken among people in my generation. The question asked was, how many times do you think you were spanked as a child? The average answer was less than 10. Which indicates that spanking is not how we were disciplined. It is not why we feared our parents. It was one thing they did. We feared our parents in the biblical sense of the term. We looked at them with a sense of awe. They were powerful people. They were powerful and they were calm, relatively speaking. Watch how calm. How many of you were raised by a woman, your mother, in most cases, I would imagine, a woman you obeyed who never yelled? She might have raised her voice to emphasize a point. My mother did that. But a woman whose voice never took off hysterically into the stratosphere. How many of you were raised by a woman like that? Raise your hands, please. Raise them up high. Hold them up so the cameras can get all these hands, you know. Look at this. It's just a sea of hands. Now, see, I don't ask questions unless I know what your answer is going to be. It's the same all over America. Now watch the second question. Is there a woman in this audience tonight, this afternoon, who can say without any hesitation or hedging whatsoever, John, my children obey me as well as I obeyed my mother, and I've never yelled? Where are those hands? You see, today's mother thinks yelling is just normal to parenthood. Yelling is not normal to parenthood. Normal to parenthood, normal still in other cultures, is a mother who is firm and certainly with her tone of voice can command, but a mother who is, generally speaking, relaxed and easygoing and straightforward. We have lost our way, ladies and gentlemen, because we today do not any longer understand that every child brings a nature with him or her into the world that inclines this child toward inappropriate behavior. We do not any longer understand. It is normal for children to lie. It is not normal for children to tell the truth. It is normal for children to be selfish. It is not normal for children to share. It is normal for children to be rebellious and disobedient. It is not normal for them to be obedient. You have to compel children to do the right things. And the earlier you enact this compelling force in their lives, a force that is contained within each and every one of you in the studio audience today, and each and every one of you parents at home watching this today, the earlier you enact this compelling force in your children's lives, and history tells this, the happier your children will be. You lay the foundations of the disciplinary process by the time your children are 3 years old, and from that point on, it's all just fine-tuning. That's all it is. Evidence. And this is also true in most other cultures today. I ask people in my parents' generation, my parents are both alive, my wife's parents are both alive. They're in their late 70s, early 80s, all of them. I ask them and I ask their peers, again, all over the country, their remembrances of children 50 years ago when they were raising kids. And these people's remembrances are so uniform that you have to take this as a valid picture of what was happening. These people tell me when I say, what were children like 50 years ago? They consistently say that by the time a child was 3 years old 50 years ago, that's when I was 3 years old 50 years ago. By the time a child was 3 years old 50 years ago, he had stopped throwing tantrums. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? That's like parenting nirvana to the modern ear. Stop throwing tantrums. Yeah, stop throwing tantrums. 50 years ago, by the time a child was 3 years old, the child had stopped openly defying parental authority. Mischievous? Yes, sure. Human beings have been mischievous since the creation. I call it the Adam and Eve syndrome. Your parent tells you not to do something, he turns back, walks away, and you do it to see if you can get away with it. Okay, that's mischief. But by the age of 3, 50 years ago, open defiance of the I'm not gonna and you can't make me sort had stopped. Again, exceptions here, there, but few and far between. Folks, this is not the few and far between exception today. This is the rule today. You see children 4, 5, 6, 7 years old in public places still throwing raging tantrums. You see children in people's homes and in public places standing up to their parents and going, I'm not going to, and so on and so forth. Well, what's happened, folks, is that we've completely lost a sense, number one, of the fact that we have to bring human nature under control, or more accurately, we have to cause the child to bring his own nature under control through compelling speech and compelling consequences as early in the child's life as this can possibly be done. Historically and cross-culturally, it suggests, the evidence suggests, this can be done as early as the 3rd year of life. Between the 2nd and 3rd birthday is when this is done, if you understand that parenthood, like any other activity, has its seasons. Ecclesiastes, book 3, verse 1. To every activity there is a season. Not some, not most, every one. It's true of parenting as well, but we no longer recognize the seasons of parenting today. Today, The mother does not transform herself into an authority figure. She just keeps right on serving. And you cannot discipline from the position of servant. You can only discipline from a position of leadership. And folks, this is what parenting's all about. From that second birthday on, parenting is about leadership. But another complication in the modern mix is that today's parent thinks that parenting is all about having a wonderful, warm and fuzzy relationship with the child, which further handicaps that parent's ability to discipline, to create a disciple, someone who will follow your lead. I'm going to show you how easy this is if you just understand the basics. First of all, you've got to understand what you're dealing with. You're dealing with little people who are inclined to do the wrong thing, not the right thing. These people are going to continue to be inclined to do the wrong thing until you compel them to begin doing the right thing. You cannot do that compelling until the 3rd year of life, but then you can do it so effectively that it's over and done with for all intents and purposes by age 3, 3.5. And then again, as it was the case 50 years ago, it's just fine-tuning from that point on. You have to recognize the seasons of parenthood. It's fine and dandy to serve for 2 years, and it's not fine and dandy to serve, primarily speaking, from that point on. And you have to understand that the attempt to have a wonderful relationship with anyone you are trying to lead in any capacity, in any area of life, completely pollutes your ability to lead. Completely. I'm just going to pick on a gentleman here. What's your name, sir?
Sean.
Sean. If I was your leader in some capacity, and for whatever reason I decide that I'd like to get to know Sean better, I don't know, there's just a kind of a vibe between us when we pass in the halls and so on and so forth. I'd like to get to know Sean better. So one day after work, I invite Sean. I'm Sean's boss now. I invite Sean to go out and have a drink with me. Would you like to go out and have a drink? Sure, he says. We can do that. So we go out and we have a drink together and we start to talk. And, over the course of the next few weeks, we go out and have a drink together after work maybe 3 or 4 times. And we begin to feel comfortable in each other's presence, and we start sharing some intimate details about our lives. He starts talking to me about, I don't know, his marital problems, and I start talking to him about my marital problems and the problems I'm having with my kids, and oh yeah, he says, I'm having those kinds of problems too. Well, I'm thinking to myself, gosh, this guy and I were on the same wavelength, so how about let's go fishing? And we plan a fishing trip. And suddenly, folks, I can't lead any of you. My attempt to have a wonderful relationship with Sean has completely crippled my ability to lead all of you. Why? Because leaders have to make, listen to this, from the point of view of being a parent leader. Leaders have to make unpopular decisions. Politicians have to make popular decisions. Leaders, of which there are few in the political ranks these days, it is incumbent upon them to make unpopular decisions. Well, now that I'm trying to have a wonderful relationship with Sean and he and I become friends, I start to worry about this. Is any decision I'm going to make upset Sean? And if I'm worried about whether Sean's going to be upset, I can't make the decision for any of you. You all suffer because I stepped out of line, you see? We've caused American parents, we mental health professionals, we have caused American parents to step out of line. And your children are suffering, and you're suffering. This whole business of mothers screaming today is all an indication that today's mothers are under more stress as parents than were mothers ever before in our history. And by the way, somebody said, well, John, doesn't that have a lot to do with the fact that women today are are working outside the home, and I mean, they're trying to juggle all these responsibilities. Women weren't working. This is actually said to me. Women weren't working 50 years ago. My mother was working 50 years ago. How many of you who raised your hand and said that you were raised by a mother you obeyed who never yelled? How many of you can again raise your hand and say, your mother was a working mother during a lot of your childhood? Raise your hands again. Right. See, this has nothing to do with being a working mother. These are all mythologies. Okay? By the way, let me tell you the difference between the working mother, my mother, 50 years ago, the working mother of today, because it's an important distinction. My mother, 50 years ago, was a single parent. She worked and she went to college. She was gone most of the time, in fact, 6 days a week. She was in a very demanding research science program. And, you know, most of the time she was either at school, in class, working. She was in the laboratory, the library. She was gone most of the time. She came home without 1 ounce of guilt on her back. Not 1 ounce. We have caused today's mother, under similar circumstances, to come home feeling like she has caused, by being absent that day from her child, a psychological deficit that must now be made up for in the child's life. And the only way it can be made up is for the woman to put on the garb of servant and dance as fast as she can in her child's life from the time she gets home from work until she finally manages to get him to bed. We have done a total number on the American female in this generation. I mean, this is a paradoxical generation of females, is it not? This is a generation of women who have taken, you know, admirable strides forward, economically, educationally, professionally, politically. And many women who claim the title liberated, even feminist, many of these women go home and immediately begin taking orders from a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old child. But what is the sense in that? How do you, by the way, I asked this question and I'll just let it sit in your minds. I'm not going to answer it, you can. How can a woman teach a 5-year-old boy to be respectful of women if the woman in question, his mother, is serving him constantly in as many different ways as she can find to serve him? You do not serve and create respect. This is why these women built the walls, set the gate. They understood that the only way you could gain your child's respect was if you limited your child's access to you. The second way of controlling the relationship is you control what you will and will not do for the child. We don't give women permission any longer to say to their children what my mother had complete permission to say to me. See, folks, all of this unleashes this strong-willed behavior that you all came here to find out how to solve. And you expected me to get up here and talk about techniques like how to use timeout and logical and natural consequences. And I'm telling you, no, no, no. It's an attitude, folks. Leadership is an attitude. It's not a set of techniques and skills. It's how you hold yourself. It's your bearing. It's your look on your face, your tone of voice. It's an attitude. You control what you will and will not do for your child, what you will and will not give to him, which is an extension of limiting access. Here's something I heard from my mother. And I never, except in my moments of wild foolishness and childhood hysteria and over-dramatics, ever thought my mother seriously, really didn't love me. But all children say these things, you know. Here's my mother. John Rosemond, you don't need a mother right now, and I'm not going to be one. Have we given permission to today's female to talk like that to her child? Listen to those. Listen to how compelling those words are. John Rosemond, very calmly, You don't need a mother right now, and I'm not going to be one. Or how about this? If we ratchet up the calm measure just slightly. You are bothering me. You had better find something to do for yourself and with yourself, or I will find something for you to do. What's it going to be? Make the decision now. By the time she'd snapped her fingers, I was gone. You know. I was out of there. You hear these women telling their children, I'm not your servant. I'm not here at your beck and call. Do not presume to think that you can interrupt me any time you want to, and that I will drop what I am doing to come rushing to your aid. Do not presume that. We do not give women permission to project the same attitude toward their children today. We give men permission to do this, which is why women quite often don't like what their husbands are doing when it comes to the children. It even raises the anxiety level of today's mother to watch her husband, because the husband has no problem saying, no, I don't have time for you right now. When I finish this, if I have enough time, then I'll do that. Meanwhile, go on, I need complete privacy here. See, a man can do that. Woman can't do that. Because you women, we, mental health professionals, we have done psychic surgery on you. And we have implanted psychological boogeymen in your brains. And these psychological boogeymen, they crawl around inside your skulls all the time, you know. And the typical American male, you know, he's an emotional Neanderthal to begin with. He doesn't have all these psychological boogeymen in his brain. He's not, you know, a man goes to work and he's not sitting at his desk at work agonizing over how's his child doing in daycare that day and should he make a call to find out. And these are things, you know, women, they sit at their desks and they go, oh, it's 3 o'clock, I wonder if he's taking his nap, you know, it's stuff like that. We have imposed, in other words, a horribly set of confining expectations on the American female and infected her thinking with what I call psychological correctness, the extension of the psychological boogeyman crawling around in her brain, telling her she mustn't do that, and she mustn't do that, and she mustn't do that. No, he's crying, you have to run over there now, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the end result of all this is that I personally believe women today cannot, as a group, claim that they are teaching their children to respect the power of the female. I learned the power of the female before I came to school. Those 70 children in Miami, they had no doubt in their minds whatsoever. 70 little people came to school in 1950, all convinced women were powerful people. They were not to be trifled with. Folks, that's how you prepare your child for school. I didn't know my ABCs and my number facts. All I knew was women were powerful people. You paid attention to women and you did what women told you to do. And simply because of those simple understandings, I was ready for school, as were those 70 kids in South Dade County, Florida in 1950. It's the mixing of leadership and relationship to the point where your leadership is really paralyzed. It's not recognizing that, as with any other human activity, there are seasons. Each season has its own parental expectations and goals for the child, which can only be achieved if your behavior is consistent with the demands of the season. And understanding also, your children are not nice. You have to compel a child to control his nature, which is narcissistic and antisocial. Here's a description of the 2-year-old child. Here's a description of his belief system. If you've lived with a toddler, a young 2-year-old, you know, this is the belief system. It has to be. The child can't express this. What I want, I deserve to have. Yes? Yes. You all agree with that? No one has the right to stand in my way. Yes? Yes. The ends justify the means. Yeah? Do you know that also describes the personality of a person incarcerated in a maximum security prison? No, folks, what I'm telling you is that human nature is the criminal personality. You exorcise the criminal personality through powerful parenting in the early years. Are we parenting powerfully today? No. You are the first generation, let's talk about discipline. You are the first generation of American parents to actually believe you can talk a child into behaving properly. You've also been propagandized to the effect that something called timeout will solve all parenting problems. Okay, I'm a psychologist, I'm going to tell you right now. And I used to be a believer in timeout, but I'm going to tell you the truth right now. Timeout works with children who are already well behaved. And these children who are already well behaved have been compelled through powerful consequences to behave. Then you can use timeout effectively. Under those circumstances, timeout is simply a little reminder. It's just a little adjustment that needs to be made at the moment. I think you need to go sit down right there. I'll tell you when you can get up. No? Sit down. Yeah, time for sorry is past. Sit down. That child, for that child, that's enough. For a child who has not yet been compelled to bring his nature under control, that's not going to be enough. You can do that, and many of you know this. You can do that with the child who's zigging and zagging and just wildly running through life. You can time this child out 100,000 million gazillion times, and the minute he gets out of the chair, he's going to start zigging and zagging around again. What is the way to discipline the strong-willed child? The child who has no psychological kinks, no biochemical or genetic disorder, but is simply a child who has not been compelled to control his nature. We have let these children become legion in America. And it's time we brought this epidemic under control, and it can be done. How do you do it? With the first principle of effective discipline. You use compelling speech. Compelling speech. Most American parents today do not use compelling speech. They use wishy-washy, wimpy speech when they talk to their children. Okay? I had a woman come up to me recently somewhere in America. I think it was Lafayette, Louisiana. And she told me that her 5-year-old daughter would not do anything she told her to do. Now, here is the way the conversation actually went. And before I get into this, I have to tell you that quite often when people ask me questions, I'm listening more to the assumptions behind the question than I am the actual form of the question itself. And so I'm dealing with the assumptions, and what I'm trying to do is rearrange this person's thinking. Okay? It's sort of like a commando attack on their assumptions. Woman comes up and she says, "John, I hope you can help me tonight. My 5-year-old daughter won't do anything I tell her to do." And I looked at her and I said, "Oh, sure she will." You see how I'm dealing with the assumptions here? I'm not going to deal with what do I do to get her to pay attention to me, etc., etc., etc. What techniques do I use? What discipline will work with her? I'm going to deal with the assumption that this child will not do anything she is told to do. Oh, sure she will. Woman looks at me for a moment with semi-shocked expression. Well, you must have misunderstood me. I said my daughter won't do anything I tell her to do. No, ma'am, I didn't misunderstand you. I heard you quite clearly, and I said, sure she will. No, John, she won't. Madam, I have to tell you, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been a parent, I'm now a grandparent. I've had a lot of contact with parents and children across America, and I think I can say with authority, I've never known a child who would not do what he or she was told most of the time. I mean, you can never create a perfect world, but most of the time. Well, John, you've never been in my house, she came back at me with. You've never been in my house because my 5-year-old daughter won't do anything I tell her to do. Ah, here's my opportunity. Rearrange her thinking now. Madam, you are a member of a generation, and furthermore, I have to tell you, you are a member of a gender that rarely tells your children to do anything. You ask, you entreat, you cajole, you plead, you bargain, you bribe. I listen to you all across America talking to your children, and you're not telling your children what to do. When you begin telling your 5-year-old daughter what to do, she will slowly but surely begin doing what you tell her to do. Here's the contrast, and I've seen these actual incidents. I hope the people in question never see this program. My wife and I are at a dinner party somewhere in America. We've been invited over to some people's houses several years ago. And the mother wants the 8-year-old daughter who's been invited to the dinner party. Now, this is nouveau parenting as well, you know. Let's include them in everything, you know, which causes them never to see you as an authority figure, just adds more confusion to the mix. She wants her daughter to sit in this chair, and she's laid out little name tags at each place, you know. Stephanie, not her real name. Stephanie, I wanted you to sit here, sweetheart. Would you please sit here? Stephanie, don't give me any troubles about this. Just sit here. The food will be the same as it will be anywhere. Stephanie, please. Stephanie, just... Oh, all right, sit where you want to. Now, did you ever hear that woman tell Stephanie to sit in that chair? No. Here's the way my mother would have dealt with that, and I dare say most of you will be able to identify with this. My mother would have said, you are going to sit here. I don't care. And if I had given my mother one more moment's resistance, my mother, and this is, again, you'll be able to identify with this. All right, come with me. Come with me. At which point I would have gone, okay, all right, I'll sit there. Nope, you had your chance to sit there. You come with me. She'd have taken me by the hand. She'd have taken me to my room. She'd have put me in my room. She would have informed me. She was going to serve me dinner in my room. She was going to give me 30 minutes to eat it, and I'm just pulling numbers out of a hat here. 30 minutes to eat it. Then she'd be upstairs to gather my plate up and tuck me into bed because my evening would be over 30 minutes from now. Mom, I'm sorry. That's the idea. Mom, I won't do it again. That's the idea. And she'd have turned around and walked out of my room, and that would have been it. You see how compelling a style of parenting that is? How many more times is that child, when told, this is your seat, going to agitate to sit somewhere else? How many more times? Somebody might say, none. And I would say, no, this is a human being. Probably 1 or 2 more times. He's going to see, was Mom just having a bad night? When he finds out, no, this is new Mom. The body snatchers came. She looks like old Mom, but she's not behaving like old Mom. Now, he's got to do that 2 or 3 times to find out. Don't expect any of this stuff to work right away, you know. Here's another example. Don't you think it's time for you to be in bed now? That's the way people talk to their children these days. My mother was not an exemplary parent, but she's my frame of reference, so I use her as an example. My mother told me when it was time for me to be in bed, "It's time for you to be in bed. Go upstairs. I'll be up in a moment to tuck you in and help you say your prayers." If I had said, "I'm not tired yet," my mother would have said, "That's all right. Stare at the ceiling all night long. You're going to bed." You see, she would have given me, the child, no wiggle room whatsoever, because the moment you give the child wiggle room, like, "All right, I'll let you stay up another 15 minutes, come on. You can give wiggle room to a child who's already well behaved. You can't do this as you are still working toward consistently good behavior. Don't kid yourselves. Giving the child wiggle room during this time is shooting yourselves in the foot. And I can go on and on and on with example after example of things I've heard the American parents say. "Do you think you can give me a hand and just help me, please, just this once? If you do this, I won't ask you to do anything more for me today, I promise." Do you hear that mother telling her child to do anything? No. My mother would have just said, "You are going to help me carry the groceries in. Come with me." And along those lines, what do leaders do? In fact, this process, this function, if you will, defines leadership. Not just compelling speech, but you affirm your leadership of a group of people, a person, in this case your child, by delegating responsibility. There is an optimal season for delegating responsibility is between the 3rd and 4th birthdays. Between the 2nd and 3rd, you're in the season of convincing this child you're no longer a servant, you are an authority figure. Once you establish that around the 3rd birthday, then it behooves you to do what you must do to affirm that child's perception of your leadership. Delegate responsibility. Do we delegate responsibility to children anymore on a consistent, regular basis? This is what you have to do. These are your chores. They have to be done. No, you're not being paid for them. They are your contribution to this family. They are going to be done because I tell you to do them. Do we do that anymore? No. We're a chore on Monday and the next chore might be on Thursday, Folks, and what are these chores? They're insignificant, really. They're the easiest things we can find our children to do. I told you my mother was a single parent for most of the first 7 years of my life. Worked, went to college, very demanding program. By the time I was 4 years old, my mother had taught me how to wash floors, and when the kitchen floor needed to be washed, I washed the kitchen floor. I was 4 years old. Children are amazingly competent. We're not actualizing their competence anymore. We're enabling and rescuing and coddling. We're not challenging. Children today have a lot of people taking care of them and very few people leading them. And this is not good for children. It was good for me to learn that at the age of 4, before the age of 4, I was competent enough to learn to wash a floor. And the way that was done, compelling speech. Here's compelling speech. I don't remember it exactly, but I can tell you that this was how my mother must have dealt with that. You look at odds for what to do with yourself today. Well, I've got some things you can help me with. In fact, it's occurred to me that you're old enough to learn how to wash a floor. I'm going to fill up the bucket and teach you how. Come with me. I heard a little ripple of laughter. You know why? Because people don't talk to their children like that anymore. My mother is not trying to entreat, cajole, persuade, explain to me why she wants me to do this. She is just saying, this is what I'm going to do. Come with me, in a very calm tone of voice. By the time I was 5 years old, my mother had taught me to wash my own clothes in her washing machine. She sewed all of my clothes for all intents and purposes. I had very few as a consequence. My mother's washing machine was a galvanized tub that sat on the side porch with hand rollers bolted to it. And I imagine that happened this way. Again, it's just, I imagine, but I'm pretty sure that it was somewhat along these lines. She probably looked at me one day and said, "John Rosemond, I washed those pants yesterday. You need them for church tomorrow. You've gone out and gotten them all stained. Now, I'm not going to wash the same pants day after day after day." You know, you're old enough to learn how to wash those yourself. Come with me, I'm going to teach you how. When you talk to a child this way, folks, I will guarantee you, now, if you've never spoken to your child like this before, you may not get this reaction right away. But I will guarantee you that the first time you will get a reaction unlike the reaction you typically get even today to giving instructions. But when you speak to a child like this, the automatic response on the part of the child, I mean, it's almost an involuntary reflex response, is to go, "Okay." Lead me. Because children, in the final analysis, they don't even know it, but they love leadership. They just love it. And folks, they love having somebody prove to them that they are competent people. They love that too. Do we prove to children that they are competent people anymore? Nah. You can't if you're doing everything for your child. If you're serving your child, you cannot bring forth your child's competence. My mother has a PhD in plant morphology. She's a brilliant woman, a research scientist, a mathematician, a statistician, highly respected in her field, which is a small branch of the life sciences. I give you that as background to a story. I came to my mother when I was in the 5th grade, needing help, I told her, with a math assignment that I did not understand. She took the book, she looked at it for a moment, and she said, "Oh, they're teaching this the same way they taught it to me when I was your age. Isn't that interesting? I'd have thought they'd have changed all this by now." Turned it back around. It was almost like she was talking to herself. Turned it back around, handed it back to me and said, "Now, I figured this out when I was your age, and so can you." See, another ripple of laughter indicating that this is something else we don't give today's woman permission to do. In fact, until I said that, described what my mother did, most of you women put in the same situation by your children asking for help with an academic assignment would not even consider that you have permission to do what my mother did. A woman who knew this material by heart, who could have solved whatever problem I had brought to her in a heartbeat. I figured this out, so can you. And she must have seen some shock on my face, because then she said, "What has caused me to remember this conversation for the rest of my life." She never talked about this. I knew it was true about her, but she never talked about it because she didn't want to be perceived as a victim, I suppose. She said, "And let me remind you, when I was your age, I was in an orphanage. I had no one to go to. And I figured this out, and so can you." And I looked at her and I went, "Mom, I'm not in an orphanage. I have a mother. You know how to do this stuff. I'm just asking for your help, okay?" No, it's not okay, because I'm not going to help you. Just as matter of fact as you please. Listen to this woman. She is not even doing what today's woman would do, and that is explaining herself to her child. Today's woman would, even if she would say, "I don't want to help you. I don't want to help you with this because I want you to find out how competent you really are." And no. My mother's just going, "Well, I'm not going to help you with it. It's just that simple. Mom, I've been working on this for 45 minutes. I can't get it." Storm clouds came across her face, and she looked at me and she said, "Don't you ever say that to me again." What? Don't you ever again, John Rosemond, tell me you've been working on something for 45 minutes and can't get it. John Rosemond, I've been working on some things in my life for 4 or 5 years now and haven't figured them out. Don't you ever again come to me and tell me you've been working on something for 45 minutes and can't get it. Do you understand me? And during this time, I remember she was sort of advancing on me. And I'm going, I thought she'd lost her, lost her nut, man. She'd gone off. And then she did something I think she'd seen the Queen of England do in a newsreel. She just went, "Go on." And I was dismissed, Now see, that's powerful love. That's powerful love. We have not given American women permission to do that, and the American female, if she sees one of her friends doing that, her anxiety level is going to go up for the child in question, because this is psychologically incorrect maternal behavior in the 21st century. See? And let me tell you, the more you women behave in ways that are psychologically correct, the more often you end up having to bring your children to us. Isn't it ironic that the very prescription that we told you to follow in child rearing has caused so many discipline problems and so many parents coming right back to us to help you with a problem we created? Because we are some of the most intellectually arrogant professionals on the face of the planet. Yeah. Who did I believe in as a who did my mother compel me to believe in as a consequence of what she did? She compelled me to believe in me. If she had taken that book and said, "Oh yes, I know how to do this. Calm down. We can do this together. We could don't cry. You've come to the right person. We can figure this out. Done it all, and there. You see, that's how to do it." Who would I have believed in? All together now? Her. Right. You have to compel a child to believe in himself, because the child always wants to take the easy way out, which is to get somebody else to do it. See? Compelling speech, compelling consequences. You have to compel with consequences. You have to compel consideration of consequences. These consequences have to be powerful. And I'm not talking about spanking. That's probably what comes to mind for a lot of people when I use the word powerful in conjunction with discipline. But although I have no problem with the spanking per se, I'm not talking about spankings. And I have a problem with the way most American parents who are spanking spank, by the way. But no problem with the spanking per se. I think there's times when it's appropriate, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about compelling a child to consider consequences when confronted in the future with the same temptation, whatever the temptation was that resulted in the misbehavior that we are talking about. Here's compelling consequences. Compelling. A woman approached me after a speaking engagement several years ago and told me this story. Her son, the most ill-behaved child in the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, and fifth grade, all during this time, the teachers trying to persuade her to take him to a psychologist or a doctor and get him put on Ritalin for attention deficit disorder. The woman, a single parent, one day, as she described it, she said she just snapped. She just snapped, and she decided after her son went to school that she was going to stay home from school that day. She enlisted the aid of a male neighbor. She went to a hardware store. She bought 2 deadbolt locks. She had the male neighbor install them on the child's bedroom door. Inside the bedroom there was a video game outfit and a television set and a stereo and all this other stuff. Child comes home from school, there are 2 deadbolt locks on his bedroom door. "What's going on, Mom?" What's going on? What's going on is that you're locked out of your room for at least a month. And every report I receive from your teacher during the next month concerning bad behavior, misbehavior at school, every single report will extend this a week. You may never get back in your room. Where am I going to sleep? You'll sleep on the sofa. I'll make it up for you every night. "This is child abuse," he screamed. She said, "Child abuse? Well, you go to school tomorrow and tell everybody that you're being abused. If they call me, I will simply tell them that of course not. I'm protecting you even more than I did before. You can only roll out of one side of the sofa." She told him he could go into his room for 10 minutes in the morning to get his clothes and 10 minutes in the evening to change his clothes into his pajamas, and that was it. Now, when she told me this, she was 3 weeks into the program. 3 weeks into the program with the worst behaved child in the 5th grade class, in the 4th grade class, in the 3rd grade class, in the 2nd grade class, in the 1st grade class. She said, John, we've only had 2 incidents in 3 weeks. We've only gotten to 6 weeks. And both of those incidents were in week 1. We're in the 2nd week of weeks without incident. She also told me that in week number 2, his primary teacher called and said, thank you for finally taking our advice and getting him evaluated for attention deficit disorder and putting him on medication. Now, this woman didn't use any pharmaceuticals to bring this about. She used a compelling discipline to bring this about. She changed his life, and she told him it will never be the same until you bring your nature under control. See, folks, the third aspect of controlling your relationship with your child, which I started talking about far earlier, is you control the consequences of the child's behavior. You can't control the child's behavior. He has to control the behavior. You can only control the consequences such that he is compelled to control his behavior. And the good news is that children, compelled properly, most of them, and I'm going to deal with this in just a second, most of them will begin putting a bridle and reins on their nature and bringing it under control. I say most because you can take 20 children, all same age, you can control for socioeconomic background, parent education, all this other stuff. All 20 children are misbehaving in the same way. I can tell all 20 parents, all right, I want you to go home and start doing this. And I can give to each and every one of those 20 parents the same compelling discipline plan. I know it's compelling because I've seen it compel before. We get together in a month. I say, raise your hand if the behavior's stopped. 15 parents will raise their hands. 5 will say, John, I started doing what you told us to do, and he doesn't care. Because, folks, this is another aspect of human nature. There are no guarantees where human nature is concerned. The fact of the matter is, you can compel some children, and you cannot compel others, and you will not know the child you can compel versus the child you can't compel until you begin to compel. And then those 2 children distinguish themselves one from the other. So you can control consequences. Let me give you the good news, however. The earlier you control consequences, the better. Why? Because you can control consequences to a great degree when the child is young, and in so doing, establish really, really powerful disciplinary precedents. You can only control consequences to a small degree when the child is older. So if you want to establish disciplinary precedents, do this when children are young. But if your children are not young, do it anyway. Do it anyway. Regardless of the age, you are going to make some progress. No matter the age of the child, no matter the history behind the problem in question. Okay, so I've talked about compelling speech, and I've talked about compelling consequences. Now I'm going to talk about getting the psychological boogeymen out of your heads, because that's the next thing you've got to do. I had a woman come up to me recently, and she was talking about her child who was hitting her. 6-year-old child, he's hitting her. Her question to me was, and listen to the psychological boogeymen talking. Her question was, John, can you help me figure out why he's so angry at me? Now, this is a tragic question, folks. This is a postmodern psychological question. The fact is that we're not dealing with children's behavior today, which is relatively easy to deal with, as this woman who gave me this testimony somewhere in America concerning the worst behaved child in the 5th grade class affirmed. Dealing with behavior is a relatively simple thing. Dealing with the behavior of children today has become extremely complicated from the perspective of the typical American parent because we, mental health professionals, have conditioned you, propagandized you to the point where you think about all of this stuff through psychological lenses. You see what Grandma saw as simply misbehavior as a psychological issue. And you let the boogeymen take over at that point in time. You start listening to their chatter, and that completely paralyzes your ability to do what you need to do. What you need to do is wipe out the psychological issue from your thinking and deal strictly with the behavior. A child hitting his mother? That's not anger. That's rage at having his narcissistic, infantile impulses not catered to by his mother. This woman needs to redefine herself to her child. How can she do that? Here's one way. He can come home from school one day and find that instead of locks being on his door, every possession has been taken out of his room. I call it at-home boot camp. Every possession has been taken out of his room except a minimum of clothing. And he is told that on Friday of every week, if there have been no incidents of aggression toward the mother that week, either physical or verbal, he will get one item back in the following order. And the item that he will get back first is the item he least desires to get back. The item that he is working for is the item he most desires to get back. Now see, we're not going to treat this as an anger problem. If we did, we wouldn't do that because doing that runs the risk of making him even more angry, doesn't it? But we're not going to think about this as anger. We're going to think strictly about this as a behavior that is indicative of a child who has a narcissistic fire burning inside of him, consuming his soul. This is a rescue attempt on the part of this parent. And we are going to rescue by using consequences that compel this child to begin controlling his narcissistic nature. And then the last thing you have to do is you have to, in arguments with your children, turn the other cheek. Give them nothing to resist against. How many of you have argumentative children? Raise your hands. You two at home, you can raise yours. Keep them up high. Let's see those argumentative children, okay? So most of you have argumentative children, or at least attest to the idea that you have argumentative children. In fact, none of you have argumentative children. You've just fallen into a trap that I set for you, and that is to reveal your contemporary thinking. The contemporary parent thinks all this stuff is coming from the child. Say, I have an argumentative child. No, folks. The argumentative child is a product of a certain parenting style. You people who raised your hand just now, you are people who all fling wide the door to argument with your child or children on a regular basis. The child in question at any given moment charges through the door before you can get it shut again. And you blame the child for the argument that ensues. I'm going to teach you how to never argue with a child again. It's what I call giving the child absolutely nothing to resist against. An argument is where you give the child something to resist against. You take away that element, the argument cannot happen. It takes two to tango in this regard. Two. Folks, your mistake, and this is why you have argumentative children, so many of you, is you try to explain yourselves to your children when they do not like a decision that you have made. You, in trying to explain yourself to your children, you try to, with word pressure, infuse an adult point of view into the mind of a child. This is what you're doing. Listen to me now, pay attention. I'm going to try and explain this to you. You're in the Gifted and Talented program. You'll understand. I know you will. Well, he may have gotten into the Gifted and Talented program, but he cannot understand an adult point of view, which can only be understood not because people describe it to you on the blackboard, but because you experience it firsthand. He's going to understand your point of view when he becomes an adult, no sooner. Until then, it's your job to model this point of view, and every time your child challenges decisions that you make, give him nothing to resist against. None of you has ever been able to convince your child in a conflict situation that your point of view should prevail. None of you. You know, none of you has ever been able to do this. You make a decision that causes your child great emotional distress. He stomps his foot, he twirls around, his hands go everywhere. All my friends can, why can't I? Not one of you folks has ever, with words, ever been able to get this child to say, oh, I get it now. Well, of course you're right, Mom. When you explain it that way, how can I disagree with you? No, the fact of the matter is, the more you try to explain yourself, the more frustrated you get. And there you are, getting closer and closer and closer to screaming again, and then feeling guilty, and then the only way to assuage the guilt is, all right, well, maybe we can compromise over this. See? And then your child learns, if he can just get you into that argument, that he'll get at least part of what he wants. You give them nothing to resist against. Go ahead and explain yourself. Go ahead and give them a reason, by the way. See, I've written a book called Because I Said So, but it's a tongue-in-cheek title, really. Because I Said So is an attitude. It's not 4 words that you should constantly say. If you say those 4 words, you begin to sound like a broken record very quickly. You don't want to sound like a broken record to your children. When your children demand an explanation for a decision you've made, that is the invitation into an argument. But I'm saying, go ahead and give them a reason. Go ahead. They're only 6. You're not old enough, you might get hurt, there's not enough money, there's not enough time, we don't believe in that, we don't like those kids. That's it. There are no other reasons. Just pull one out and give it to them, okay? Well, you're not old enough. Now, the only reason they're asking for a reason is because they don't like the decision you've made. If they like the decision, they don't ever ask for a reason, do they? If you say to your 15-year-old daughter, sure, you can drive to Florida and spend the weekend with an 18-year-old boy I've never met. You know, she's not going to stand there and go, why? No, they only want reasons for decisions they don't like. Here's a fact. If they don't like the decision, they're not going to like the reason you give to support it. Go ahead and give the reason. When the child says, and however he says it, I don't like that reason, I don't accept that reason. Watch this. Hey, listen, if I was your age, I wouldn't accept it either. Look at that. You're giving them nothing to resist against. Like it takes all the wind out of their sails. I hate you. Oh yeah, I'd hate me too right now if I was you. By the way, I'm going to stop right there. Somebody recently said to me, well, John, come on now. You can't let a child say he hates you. And I said, why not? Well, it's disrespect. No, that's not disrespect. That is not a statement about you. You know, it's disrespectful for a child to say, you're stupid. That's a statement about you. That's disrespect. Yeah, you've got to deal with that. Well, you should have kept that to yourself. Let's see. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. Gosh, you're going to spend the rest of the day in your room. I'm going to serve you dinner up there. You're going to bed immediately after dinner. You're sorry, eh? Yeah, I would be too at this moment in time. Now, let's go to your room. You're going to have to deal with that. But I hate you? that's not a statement about you. That's a statement about Him. You hate me? Oh, listen, I'd hate me too if I was you right now. It's okay. It's all right. You know, see, you just take all the wind out of their sails. Oh, I'd feel the same way. I'd feel the same way. And you just stand there sort of infuriatingly calm as this child tries to get you to resist him. And you are providing absolutely no resistance. And if you provide absolutely no resistance, if you just simply turn the other cheek as often as it needs to be turned, hey, sure, I'll turn it this way. Yeah, sure, I'll turn it. You know, it just, the whole attempt dies a natural death. And when you see it beginning to die, well, then it's time for you to just say, hey, check you out later, and walk away, you know. I call it pulling the plug on the power struggle. See, this stuff is so simple, folks, and people in previous generations, they understood the simplicity of being a parent. They understood that, you know, look, it is hard to lead another adult. There are all kinds of considerations that you have to make when you're leading another adult. Folks, it is not hard to lead a child. A child is the easiest of all human beings to lead. And also, it is most essential that we lead properly so that we teach through this leadership that they bring their nature under control. You lead with compelling speech. You lead with compelling consequences. And at the same time, you give them nothing to resist against. See, when you stop thinking psychologically about all this, folks, I guarantee there's many of you out there, even in our home audience today, who are thinking, gosh, this really does sound simple. Because it is, folks, and it's not overly simplistic, because I've been where you are today, many of you, with my children, learned my lessons the hard way, and I saw when you just get simple, all this stuff begins to evaporate. Slowly but surely. Don't expect Rome to be built in a day. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your support of public television around the USA. Thank you, folks. Thanks much.